rising like medieval castles against desolate landscapes. Early 20th century mental hospitals were designed to be as imposing as they were isolated. The architectural philosophy behind these institutions, known as the Kirkbride Plan, was developed by psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride in the late 1800s. His ideas influenced asylum designs for decades. The buildings, with their towering spires and sprawling wings arranged in a batwing formation, were meant to embody what Kirkbride called a special apparatus for lunacy. In his 1854 treatise on the construction of hospitals for the insane, Kirkbride argued that the architecture itself was a curative instrument. His ideas transformed the design of mental institutions, creating over 70 asylums across America, each costing an average of $2.5 million at the time, which equates to roughly $60 million today. The Buffalo State Hospital, designed by architect Henry Hobson Richardson in 1871 and operational well into the 1900s, stands as an example of this imposing style. Its massive Medina. Sandstone walls stretch 2,200 feet from end to end, topped by two copper-capped towers that rose 185 feet into the sky. Richardson's design, which cost $2.3 million at the time, featured Victorian Gothic details, earning the hospital the nickname The Castle. Dr. James Dean, the superintendent from 1900 to 1912, wrote in his annual report, "The very architecture speaks to the soul of the afflicted, reminding them of their separation from the world of the sane." The construction of the hospital required over 8 million bricks and employed 200 stonemasons for 3 years. Though local legend claimed that Richardson was eventually committed to an asylum himself, he died of Bright's disease in 1886. The hospital's patient population peaked in 1935, reaching 3,800 patients, despite being designed to house only 600. In Massachusetts, the Worcester State Hospital, rebuilt in 1901 following a fire, incorporated modern innovations for patient care. Its corridors stretched nearly a mile, with patient wings arranged in a linear layout. Superintendent Dr. Hosea Quinby believed this arrangement would properly classify patients and prevent the mixing of different grades of insanity. However, the reality was much darker. Former nurse Elizabeth Clark, writing in her 1918 diary, described the conditions. The halls echo with screams at night, and the stench of unwashed bodies and soiled bedding pervades every corner. We house 1,800 patients in spaces designed for 1,200. The hospital's infamous violent ward, located at the furthest wing, housed patients in cells measuring just 6 by 8 feet. A 1924 investigation revealed that some patients had been confined to these cells for over a decade without stepping outside. The Danvers State Hospital, situated atop Hathorne Hill in Massachusetts, became infamous for its Gothic architecture and harsh conditions. Opening in 1878 and peaking in the 1920s, the hospital stretched 1,700 feet from end to end, with its central tower visible for miles. 1923 report by social reformer Dorothea Dix described the conditions. 40 patients crowded into dorms designed for 20, sleeping on thin mattresses laid directly on the floor. The walls weep with condensation, and rats scurry openly through the wards at night. The hospital's architect, Nathaniel Bradley, incorporated numerous symbolic elements into the design. The 13 towers represented the original American colonies, with one for each, and Christ with his apostles. The underground tunnels, which connected all buildings and spanned over 2 miles, were used not only for utilities but also to discreetly transport deceased patients to the morgue. By 1939, the patient population had swelled to 2,360, with only one doctor for every 250 patients. The Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey, Built in 1876 and operational until the mid-1900s, was the largest continuous foundation building in the United States before the Pentagon was constructed. The Second Empire Victorian-style main building housed over 7,700 patients by 1927, nearly 5 times its intended capacity. Former patient Mary Jane Ward, author of The Snake Pit, described the overcrowding. "We slept head to foot in rows so tight you couldn't walk between the beds. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and disinfectant." The hospital's farm colony, staffed by patients, produced over 260,000 pounds of vegetables and supported a herd of 490 dairy cows, making it self-sufficient while relying on unpaid patient labor. Life within these institutions followed a strict, regimented schedule designed to maintain order amidst overwhelming numbers. Pilgrim State Hospital in New York, which housed over 14,000 patients by 1954, was the largest psychiatric hospital in the world at the time. Daily routines were rigidly structured. 5:30 a.m. to 6 a.m. cold bath, 6:30 a.m. breakfast, 7 a.m. ward cleaning, and 8 a.m. mandatory yard time, weather permitting. Dr. William J. Tiffany, superintendent from 1931 to 1943, recorded that patients worked over 100,000 hours of unpaid labor monthly, valued at approximately $25,000 in 1935 currency. The hospital's massive kitchen prepared 42,000 meals daily, using industrial-sized equipment, including a coffee pot capable of brewing 600 gallons at once. The architecture itself was often designed to control patient behavior. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, constructed with hand-cut limestone blocks, featured long, straight corridors that allowed staff to observe patients from a distance. The building's designer, Richard Andrews, incorporated what he called therapeutic architecture, with high ceilings to promote air circulation, large windows for natural light, and separate wings for different categories of patients. Construction began in 1858 and continued through the Civil War, when the Union Army briefly used it as a military post. By 1938, the institution housed 2,400 patients in space designed for 250, leading to conditions that Dr. Arthur Noyes described in his inspection report as more suited to housing cattle than human beings. The Camarillo State Mental Hospital in California, opened in 1936, attempted to break from the Gothic tradition with a Spanish colonial revival style. However, it still adhered to the principles of isolation and containment. Its sprawling 1,500-acre campus featured open-air corridors and courtyards that Superintendent Dr. Thomas Harris claimed would provide therapeutic benefits through exposure to fresh air and sunlight. Yet, as former attendant James Miller's 1943 account reveals, the beautiful exterior masked horrific interior conditions. Patients were often left to sit in their own filth, some chained to benches in the courtyards for days at a time. The hospital had its own police force and fire department, and by 1957 housed over 7,000 patients, tended to by a staff of 1,800. Living conditions varied dramatically between paying and non-paying patients at the McLean Hospital in Massachusetts. Wealthy patients enjoyed private rooms with personal servants, while in the public wards, patients slept in crowded dormitories. Poet Robert Lowell, treated there in 1958, described the contrast in his work, "Waking in the Blue. Your day makes my agonized blue window bleaker. Crows mourners on the petrified fairway absence, my heart grows tense as though a harpoon were sparring for the kill." Dr. Edward Cowes, superintendent from 1879 to 1904, justified this disparity in his 1908 memoir. The different social classes require different accommodations to maintain their accustomed mode of living, which is essential to their recovery. The hospital's records show that in 1912, Private patients paid up to $100 per week, $2,600 in today's money, while state-funded patients cost the institution approximately $3.50 per week. The architecture of these institutions, grand as it was, often masked their true purpose: confinement, not healing. The Traverse City State Hospital in Michigan, with its distinctive spires and Gothic windows, was described by visiting journalist Nellie Bly in 1919 as a palace for the mad. The building featured over 1,000 windows, each with its own unique arch design, and required a full-time team of 4 glaziers just to maintain them. The facility's heating system consumed 11,000 tons of coal annually, delivered by a dedicated railway spur. However, Bly's subsequent expose revealed the darker reality behind the ornate facade. Wards where patients were strapped to beds, where the kitchens were strapped to beds, where the sounds of suffering echoed through barred windows, and where the grand architecture served only to remind inhabitants of their separation from the world beyond the walls. A former patient, writing under the pseudonym Patient N82, published a series of letters in the Northern Express in 1915, describing how the beauty of the building became a mockery when one realized it was merely a glorified cage. The architectural legacy of these institutions extends beyond their imposing structures. St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., established in 1855 as the government hospital for the insane, pioneered the concept of cottages rather than traditional wards. By 1940, its campus included 112 buildings spread across 350 acres. Chief architect Thomas U. Walter, who also designed the U.S. Capitol Dome, incorporated innovative features such as circular wards that allowed a single nurse to observe all patients from a central station. Famous patients included presidential assassin Charles Guiteau and poet Ezra Pound. Dr. William Allinson White, superintendent from 1903 to 1937, wrote in his memoirs, "These buildings are not merely shelters, but instruments of treatment, each brick and stone laid with the purpose of containing and controlling the chaos of the diseased mind." Asylums in the early 20th century were not only places of confinement. They were also laboratories for some of the most controversial and damaging treatments in psychiatric history. Between 1900 and 1950, a series of grim procedures were performed on patients in a desperate attempt to cure what was seen as mental illness. One of the most infamous treatments was the lobotomy. Dr. Walter Freeman, often considered the father of the lobotomy in America, believed mental illness was caused by overactive emotions, and that cutting the connections to and from the prefrontal cortex would reduce a patient's feelings to a more manageable level. Freeman's transorbital lobotomy, first performed in 1946, was done using an ice pick-like instrument inserted through the eye socket. Freeman performed over 3,500 lobotomies, including the tragic case of Rosemary Kennedy in 1941, the sister of future President John F. Kennedy, who was left severely incapacitated after the procedure. While lobotomies were being performed, other institutions relied on what was termed moral treatment. At Worcester State Hospital in Massachusetts, under Dr. Samuel Woodward in the early 1900s, a strict regimen of daily activities, including manual labor and religious services, was implemented. Patients were expected to conform to societal norms through what was essentially behavioral modification. As Dr. Woodward wrote in his 1912 diary, the patient must learn to govern himself, to submit to authority, and to engage in useful occupation. Willard State Hospital in New York took this to an extreme, requiring patients to work up to 12 hours a day in extensive farming operations. The hospital's records show that in 1915, patient labor produced over 2,000 pounds of vegetables and maintained a dairy herd of 200 cows, making the hospital self-sufficient while using unpaid patient labor. In 1927, Austrian psychiatrist Manfred Sakel accidentally discovered insulin shock therapy while treating patients with drug dependency. The treatment, which involved inducing hypoglycemic comas through insulin injections, spread rapidly across Europe and America. At New York's Pilgrim State Hospital, over 2,000 patients underwent insulin shock therapy between 1936 and 1945, with a reported 88% cure rate for schizophrenic patients. However, follow-up studies revealed high relapse rates and numerous deaths due to prolonged comas. Dr. Harold Bourne, a critic of the treatment, stated in 1938, "We are not treating diseases. We are treating human beings whose problems cannot be solved by putting them into comas." Perhaps the most enduring and controversial treatment was electroconvulsive therapy, first developed by Italian psychiatrists Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini in 1938. The first human subject was a 39-year-old engineer found wandering the streets of Rome speaking incomprehensible gibberish. After the first treatment, the patient responded, "Not another one, it's deadly." Despite this haunting plea, the treatment continued and the patient eventually showed improvement. By 1940, ECT had spread to the United States, where it was administered without anesthesia or muscle relaxants, often resulting in broken bones from violent convulsions. Isolation rooms, also known as quiet rooms or padded cells, were standard features in most institutions. The Friends Asylum in Philadelphia maintained detailed records, showing that in 1915, 40% of their patients spent time in isolation, with stays ranging from hours to months. The rooms were often barely large enough for a single bed, with walls padded with horsehair stuffed leather or canvas to prevent self-injury. At the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, isolation rooms in the basement level became notorious for their conditions. A 1921 staff journal entry described them as dungeons where the light of day never penetrates and the unfortunate occupants are condemned to exist in perpetual twilight.